Hi, I'm Adam Summer. You're listening to the Yerushalmi Talk podcast with the support of the Yeshivat Javar Yerushalayim in Har Nof, Jerusalem. And we're going to be going over a different set of ideas for Peah. So in the past, we were establishing the size of the Peah obligation. Now it's going to try to figure out from the location of the field where Peah has to be left. And it's also going to be trying to figure out something, whether it's deraita or not deraita. In other words, it says from the end of your field, and is that going to be considered deraita or not? And there's a lot going on here. First of all, I want to remind everyone that in the parsha, that Peah is next to honest weights and measures, and Peah is next to theft, not stealing. So you'll see why this comes up here, because it's very possible for people to play games with it. In fact, in the Bavli and the Yerushalmi later on, it's going to point to this problem that could come up if Peah is not left correctly. And here's the problem that they're going to be addressing as context for understanding this Mishnah. So one of the problems can be that, and this in the Yerushalmi will be in chapter 4, Halacha 3, it'll be that poor people will know exactly when and where to get their Peah. In other words, everybody opens up the Torah, they see from the end of the field, and they know that they should go look at the end of the field to find the Peah. So let's say you have a very, 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 very large field, as you have had before in agriculture. So you don't want to waste the poor person's time. You want to make it easy for them to find. And if you start putting it in different locations, you'll have a problem. And another problem is that if he's not putting it in the right location at the end, you're going to get this Morris Ein problem where people are going to start to suspect the farmer of not having left Peah at all and not meeting his obligation, even if he already did. Perhaps he's leaving it at a different location in the field. And there's another problem with not leaving it at the end of the field, because you're going to have dishonest farmers who are going to come and try to get out of the Peah obligation. And they're going to say that I did leave it. I just left it over there somewhere else. And they're going to play games with the poor people or the old people. And really, they're going to keep the Peah for themselves. The other issue to leave Peah at the end of the field is it's gonna stop the farmer from playing games where he can leave it over here and designate it for his friend to take. Like, let's say he has a poor friend and he's harvesting and he says, "Oh, I just left the Peah over here, not at the end, but it's over here, and you come take it, not these other old people or poor people. I want for these specific people to get it." So you could have a game where in a way he did leave Peah, but he left it for his friend, and we know that that's really not how Peah is done. Peah is supposed to be unattached to any individual. It has to be a poor person, but it can't be designated where it's like, oh, I'm setting Peah for that particular person. And so by doing it where it's at the end of the field, the farmer can't do that. The other thing about leaving it at the end of the field is that as you're seeing the harvest come, as the poor people are walking over, they'll be able to wait a little bit and then identify, like, oh, well, this part is Peah and this is not his commercial crop. So the Mishnah goes like this. It says, one may give Peah even from the beginning of the field or from its middle. And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochi says he may give Peah at the beginning or the middle, provided he also gives Peah at the end according to its measure. So this is going to look like, there's two ways to read this. One way to read it is that the Tanakama are saying that you can leave it in the middle or in the beginning, and that you don't have to leave it at the end. In other words, what you did does count as Peah. And it could look like Shimon Bar Yochai is disagreeing and saying that, yeah, you could give Peah at the beginning or the middle, but there has to be part of it that's left over at the end. Another way to read it is that actually there's no disagreement between the Tanakama at all and Shimon Bar Yochai, and that Shimon Bar Yochai would say that even the sages would agree that if you left part of it over at the end, the middle or the beginning part counts as Peah. So that's a sort of one way to look at it. The note here by the Mara Fulda is as follows. It says, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai agrees with the Tanakama that the grain that was left as Peah at the beginning or middle of the field has status even if nothing was left at the end. However, Shimon Bar Yochai is maintaining that the farmer has not fully fulfilled his Peah obligation until he leaves the measure of Peah at the end of the field. So it could be read that Shimon Bar Yochai is effectively saying that, yeah, this part here is Peah, that let's say he left it in the middle of the field. He's saying, though, that if you didn't leave part of it at the end, that you didn't, that this Peah over here is Peah, but you didn't do Peah. Okay, so that's one way to read it. The other way to read it is that the Peah that's left at the end of the field is what's actually triggering the Peah and is what is actually going to combine with the middle and the start to actually be called Peah. That's another way to read Shimon Bar Yochai. The Mishnah continues and it says that Rabbi Yehuda says, if the owner left over at least one stalk as Peah at the end of the field, he may join it as Peah, the produce he left in the beginning or middle of the field. But if not, if he did not leave at least one stalk of Peah at the end of the field, he has given the portion which he left in the beginning and the middle of the field only as Hefker. So Rabbi Yehuda is bringing up a really important point. He's effectively saying that the giving a Peah at the end of the field is Doraita, that you have to do that in some part. He's saying that if you didn't do that, if you didn't leave that, what would be the status of the crop that's in the middle of the field that you left and you said, oh, this is Peah? He's effectively saying it's not Peah at all, it's actually Hefker. Why does that matter? I'll tell you why. Because Peah and Hefker both do not have tithes. So what the difference is that Hefker can be collected by the rich, but Peah is only collected by the poor. With Rabbi Yehuda coming and defining it as Hefker, it's necessary. It's very important that he does that because he's coming along to say that you didn't do the obligation of Peah. This itself doesn't have the halachic status of Peah. And why does that matter for the grain crop? Because if you didn't define that as Hefker, then it would be subject to tithes. So he comes along and he says, no, this is not Peah, but it's also not subject to tithes. It's going to be having the status of Hefker. So one could read it as a way where Rabbi Yehuda is disagreeing on it. One could also read it as if he's not disagreeing, but rather he's coming to define if it wasn't done right, where it would be having the status of Hefker, so that you would know that it doesn't have tithes. another important point here is that you would say to yourself, wait a second, why would any of this be in the middle? How can it be? So you have to imagine back to the story of Ruth and how they're gathering all the grain by hand and they're harvesting by hand. And if you have a very, very large field, yeah, the rule is that with Peah, yeah, you're supposed to come and collect it all in one go. But what happens if the field is so large and you don't have enough workers that it's going to take you 2 days to do it? So now you have a problem because you have people that are coming every day to the field. You come and you do the work and you have half of the field, you harvest half the field, but it's not physically possible to finish the rest of the field on that day. It's just not possible. So what do? Do you leave part of it over from the middle? Now we know that from what we learned before that it's not exactly from the beginning of the field because you have to start to cut the field. Peah, the obligation for Peah doesn't trigger until you start to cut the field. So you could say, oh well, it's from somewhere close to the beginning, right? But then we already established that you have to leave a 60th. Now how do we qualify and quantify that? If you cut half the field and then you got to cut the other half of the field tomorrow, how do you measure 1/60th? Are you doing 1/60th today from the half that we're doing today? And then we're doing another 1/60th of what's left over. And in that case, if you add it up, it actually comes up to 1/40th. So how do we measure it? So there are a lot of issues that are going on here. And again, we have to be careful because we want to do the obligation of Hefker and of Peah. We don't want it to be Hefker. And we want to leave it over so that we're doing the mitzvah so that what we have left is actually Peah. We're not trying to leave Hefker, we're trying to leave Peah. So the question is, how are you doing it so that halachically this has the status of Peah and not Hefker? So the Gemara is going to take us to a lot of deep points here, and it's going to start off like so many Yerushalmis do, trying to go through the diktuk so that we can understand how the halacha is going to be in the writing of the Torah. Tana Kama comes along and says, one may give Peah from the beginning of the field, says the Sugya, or from its middle, even without leaving Peah at the end. And again, just to sum up, we want to leave Peah at the end. One is because it might actually be Doraita. The other thing about it is that this is really the choicest way to do the mitzvah. Really, when you're trying to do the mitzvah of Peah, it really is supposed to be at the end of the field. That's what the Torah says. That is really the best way to do it. But again, we're talking about a case where you have a field and it's so big that you can't harvest it with your labor in one day. You need 2 days to do it. You need 3 days to do it. It's not physically possible. So what do? Okay, it's not possible to do it in the choicest way because you can't gather all the grain. So the Gemara is going to talk about the source for this opinion. Rabbi Yossi says in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, in commanding the mitzvah of Peah, the Torah writes, quote, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not finish off the corner of your field to reap. So this can be found in Leviticus 19:9. And the Gemara is going to point out, hey, wait a second. There's a lot going on here in the text. Why is the extra word to reap at the end of it? You already know that you are reaping. So the Sugya says, what does the Torah come to teach with the word to reap at the end? Says, in other words, the note is that we already know from the opening phrase, when you reap, that the command, you shall not finish off the corner of your field, is a prohibition not to reap the corner. So then what is the purpose of the concluding verse to reap? In other words, it seems to be extra. Rabbi Yossi is saying that rather it teaches that even if one has yet more to reap, he can still leave Peah. He does not need to wait until the end of the field to do so. So the Sadeh Yeshua notes that the word liketzer has a future connotation. So he's interpreting it as yet to reap. So the verse implies the leaving of the field has this idea of, well, there's more to reap to come. That's the case we're talking about. Perhaps it's going to take 2 days. So the way this is being read and interpreted, that in a 2-day process, you don't wait to leave Peah until the second day, that you should leave something over on the first day, because poor people are going to be coming to your field to collect Peah. So that you really can't leave them without something when they come for this journey. You can't sit there and say, sorry, the Peah is going to be there tomorrow. So that's a one way to read this. There's going to be another way to read this. So another Amorah quotes Shimon ben Lakish, and there's going to be another way to derive understanding from it. Rabbi Yonah says, in the name of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, the verse begins by saying, when you reap. And what does the Torah come to teach with the concluding word to reap? Rather, one word teaches that Peah may be left in the beginning of the field, and one word, Peah, may be left at the end of the field. So by having this extra verse, Rabbi Yonah's basically saying that it really means that the Peah you're doing would be like for the first day, from somewhere close to the beginning. Again, you have to start the Peah obligation by cutting, so somewhere close to the beginning or in the middle of the field, and that the other writing of it means in the end of the field. So this is coming to teach us that this extra word really is showing that you can split up Peah a couple of times in the process, so that somebody's not leaving empty-handed, and that or it could be read as likotzer, yet to reap. So either which way you're reading it, this is a way to take these two expressions, to reap, and to get something out of it. Now something for the Omer. So Rabbi Yossi says, in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi, the verse begins by saying, when you reap, and what then does the Torah come to teach with the concluding word to reap in Leviticus 19:9? It says, rather, one term refers to a reaping performed for the temple for the sake of the Omer offering, and one term refers to a reaping performed for an ordinary person. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is coming to teach that actually this verse is a critical thing for understanding how the function of the temple works, because one word to reap is going to be in a normal circumstance for you and me. And in the second word to reap is going to have to do with halachic issues with the temple and the Omer. And it's going to come to explain that, because actually we know that Peah itself doesn't have any sanctity. And we know that when the temple goes and buys something, it has sanctity. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is coming to teach that this verse is actually coming to resolve that, because every year we have to do the Omer offering, and the temple is going to buy the land. Sorry, pay the farmer to plant the crops to go and harvest it. So what happens? Does this have kedusha or not? What's going on with it? And would you have to leave Peah from a field that the temple is taking money to go do? But how can you do that? Because it doesn't have sanctity. So we have a big problem here. So the Gemara is gonna explain. So the Gemara is going to challenge this need for a special verse to teach the Peah obligation in this case. Rabbi Yudin asks, but is consecrated money capable of being deconsecrated except onto something that is detachable from the ground or is detached from the ground? Is it possible for it to be deconsecrated onto something that is attached to the ground? And certainly not. I mean, we know that hekdesh can only be deconsecrated onto a movable object and not onto land and not onto something that's already attached to the land. That's in Bavli Baba Metzia 54a. So what then could this be talking about? In other words, if the temple comes along and takes temple property and pays the farmer to farm all this barley and grow it in the field in order to purchase the barley to use at the Omer offering, would it be then that this this harvest, which is taking place for the temple, would the farmer still have to leave Peah? That's what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is really getting at. So the one way to read this is that actually at the time of the harvest, when you are detaching it, then that's when it would get the sanctity, and when it's attached to the ground, it would not be getting sanctity. So effectively, what Rabbi Yossi is saying in the name of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi in this reading is that the Torah is saying that it's obvious that the barley harvested for the Omer offering is obligated to Peah. Why? Because it doesn't yet have sanctity. It's not cut yet. It only gets the sanctity when it's cut. So that while it's still attached to the ground, it's still for the farmer to come and to leave Peah. So effectively what Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi is saying is that without this verse, you reap, this extra word, that you wouldn't know that with this sanctified crop that the temple is using to leave for the Omer later, you wouldn't really know that you have to leave Peah from it. So that you could say that, well, maybe it has some sort of sanctity to it. And he's saying that this is what the Gemara is coming to, the Torah part is coming to teach. So the Gemara is gonna answer that Rabbi Hanina says the verse is necessary, so that it should not say, "Shall the harvest of hekdesh be obligated in Peah like the harvest of an ordinary person?" In other words, that the barley belongs to the farmer at the time of the harvest, but you could say that that it should have the same status as if it belonged to the temple, so that if it did belong to the temple, it would have some sort of sanctity, so then it would be not obligated to Peah. So, because you'd say, oh, well, it's being harvested for the sake of the temple. So the Torah, therefore, is teaching that it is, in fact, obligated to the temple. And we know that also from the Bavli and Baba Metzia 54a, because that you can't, it doesn't, something that's attached to the ground doesn't have sanctity. So that's another way to read this verse in the Torah and another understanding. So the Mishnah is going to continue the conversation. So the Gemara is going to continue this conversation from the Mishnah. It's going to say that Rabbi Shimon says one may give Peah from the beginning of the field or its middle, provided he also gives at the end according to its measure, to the measure. So the Gemara is going to inquire, the first grain, the grain he designated as Peah in the beginning or the middle of the field, what is its status? Is it considered Peah or not? Surely we would like to know that too, because hey, the farmer goes and does the work. He doesn't get a chance to finish the field yet. He didn't do the end of it. He didn't do the end of it on the second day. So if he leaves part of it in the middle, is that Peah or not? That's one way to read what Shimon Bar Yochai is asking. The Rosh Cirillo says as follows. Says, does Shimon Bar Yochai mean that after he gives Peah at the end, everything, both what he gave at the end plus what he gave at the beginning or middle, is considered Peah? That would make it exempt from, and would that make it exempt from Meiser? Or does he mean that only what he gives at the end is considered Peah, and what he says, provided he gives at the end, he means merely that he may not take back what he gave earlier, that it belongs to the poor, but it is not considered Peah, and it would be obligated in Meiser. So there's a lot of ways to read what Shimon Bar Yochai is saying. So the Gemara replies, says the answer may be deduced from what was taught in a Baraisa. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, if he gave Peah in the beginning or in the middle of the field, it is Peah, but he needs to give also at the end according to its measure. And this tells us that the first grain acquires the status of Peah. This is from the Tesefta in 1.5. So the Rosh Cirillo says that the statement, it is Peah, implies that it is fully Peah, even to the extent of being exempt from Meiser. So that even if he didn't leave the end of the field yet on the second day, that this has the halachic status of Peah on the first day. So there's no problem with it having some other status. So why do we care about it having some other status? Some people could come along and say, well, you didn't leave the end of the field yet on the second day, so maybe this is not Peah. Maybe it would be obligated to tithes. So that's not the case. It is Peah, and it's not obligated to tithe. It says this brisa. So it continues. It says, Rabbi Shimon states that he must give Peah at the end according to the measure. And the Gemara is going to inquire what that means. What is the meaning of this phrase, according to the measure? Does it mean according to the measure of his entire field? In other words, 1/60th of the whole field? Or does it mean according to the measure of what remains unharvested after he sets aside Peah in the beginning or middle of the field? In other words, 1/60th of the unharvested portion. And by the way, if you do the math and you're leaving 1/60th on the first day and you're leaving 1/60th on the second day, what does that come up to? It's going to be a total in Peah of 1/40th, not 1/60th. So they're trying to figure out that, hey, when you're leaving Peah on the first day, are you going to do the math so that it's going to be less than 1/60th on the first day, and then on the second day you're doing the remainder so that in total it comes up to 160? Or on the first day when you're leaving Peah, you got to say, hey, I got to leave the Rabbanan 1/60th, so here's 1/60th of the first day, and then I'm going to go on the second day, I'm going to go and plow the field, and now I'm going to go leave 1/60th on the second day. And by the way, that's actually going to end up coming up with 1/40th. So what's going on here? So here's what the Maral Fulda says. Maral Fulda says, having concluded that even the amount set aside in the beginning or middle has a status of Peah, the Gemara inquires what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai means when he says that the owner must give at the end according to the measure. Does he mean that the farmer must give 1/60th of the entire field? And what he gave earlier, while it has a status of Peah, does not discharge the obligation of Peah at all? Or perhaps it means that the farmer must only give 1/60th of what remained unharvested at the time he separated the first Peah. So it's so one way to think about it is that even if the farmer set aside in the beginning or the middle of the field an amount equal to 1/60th of the entire field, he must still set aside something at the end where it'd be an amount of 1/60th. But would that be of 1/60th of what remained on the second day on this time that would be unharvested? So that's what's unclear. So the Gemara is going to try to clarify it. So the Gemara is going to ask, is it possible to say that what was set aside in the beginning or the middle acquires the status of Peah, and still say that the owner must set aside Peah at the end according to its measure of his entire field? Why, if what was set aside earlier is considered Peah, obviously it must have exempted what was harvested until that point. Rather, Shimon Bar Yochai means that what he must set aside at the end according to the measure of what remains unharvested at the time he sets aside for Peah at the beginning or the middle. So here's what the Vilna Gaon says. The Vilna Gaon is going to say that what he set aside in the beginning or the middle is Peah for what he harvested until that point. And the phrase, the measure of what remains, means, according to the Vilna Gaon, that what remained unharvested at the time Peah was given at the beginning or middle. So the question is that, okay, well, so now you're ending up with something that ends up being greater than 1/60th in total, because you're leaving 1/60th on the first day, and then you're going to be leaving from the remainder of what has to be done on the second day 1/60th. So the Gemara is gonna so just want to clarify that I'm not sure that this is halacha lemaisa, and that there's a lot of ways to read this text. It's there's a lot of ways to interpret it, so that in order to get really what the halacha lemaisa would be, you have to go and check what the Chazon Ish writes to get what the halacha lemaisa would be if it gets broken up into multiple days. So the sugya is going to continue. The Gemara turns to analyze Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Rabbi Chia says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the one stalk which Rabbi Yehuda requires be left at the end of the field must be attached to the ground. But Rabbi Yassa says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, the final stalk may even be detached from the ground. Wow, so it looks like they're contradicting. But in fact, they're not going to be contradicting at all, as the Gemara is going to show us. So we want to go back to this idea of the end of the field. So again, this question is okay. Well, let's say the person doesn't leave any Peah at the end of the field. Did he do the obligation of Peah at all? Maybe on the first day, the Peah that he left there is Peah from the first day, but actually when he's finished harvesting the entire field on the subsequent days, if he didn't leave Peah at the end, from Rabbi Yehuda's position, he did not actually do the obligation of Peah. The status might be, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that this might be in some kind of classification of Hefker, but according to Shimon Bar Yochai, this might still have the status of Peah from the first day, but not having left it from the end of the field, that you actually didn't do the obligation of Peah. You might have left some Peah, but you didn't actually do it. So very, very important that when you're doing the Peah, you try to leave it from the end. That's the choicest way to do it, so there's no complexity in how you're carrying it out. So the Gemara is going to inquire about the extent of Rabbi Yassa's leniency. What case is Rabbi Yassa referring to? Is it where the farmer intends to use the final stalk to exempt the field from its pay obligation? Or is it even where he does not intend to use the final stalk towards obligation? In other words, the Mara Fulda is going to point out, does Rabbi Yassa mean that the farmer did not leave in the beginning or middle of his field enough stalks to equal 1/60th of the field, and now with the final stalk he is completing the measure of 1/60th? So according to this aspect of the question, only in such a case would Rabbi Yasa permit the final stalk to be detached since it's part of the primary obligation? Or does he mean that even in a case in which the farmer already left in the beginning or middle an amount of stalks totaling 1/60th of the field, and he's leaving this final stalk only to comply with the rule that some peah must be left at the end? Still, the final stalk may be detached. That's the question. So the Gemara is going to answer. It's going to say, let us learn from the answer from the following other statement of Rabbi Yasa. For Rabbi Yasa said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, also an explanation of Rabbi Yudah's opinion that the farmer must leave at least one stalk at the end of the field in order for what was left in the beginning or the middle to be considered peah. So the sugya says the farmer may always go on adding stalks onto what he left in the beginning or the middle of the field. Now, the word always implies that he may even add detached stalks, as Rabbi Yasa said in the earlier statement. And the word add implies that what he left as peah at the end of the field is in addition to the minimum 1/60th. And the sugya says, with what then are we dealing with in Rabbi Yasa's earlier statement, where he says that the stalk left at the end may be detached? It says he refers specifically to where the farmer intends to exempt his field with that stalk, where that stalk is needed to complete the measure of 1/60th. So we see from Rabbi Yasa's other statement that he is discussing even where the field was already exempted by what was set aside in the beginning or the middle. In other words, what was left in the beginning or the middle of the field was 1/60th in its own right. Rather, what we are dealing with in Rabbi Yasa's earlier statement is where the farmer does not intend to exempt his field with the final detached stalk. So the Sedei Yeshua is going to explain this. It's going to say that the question arises, did we not learn earlier in this tractate that once the full measure of 1/60th has been given from a field, anything set aside subsequently as peah does not acquire the status of peah and is obligated in meiser? How then, says the Sedei Yeshua, can Rabbi Yasa state here that even though the peah was already exempted by giving of the full amount of peah, that person can still give additional peah? So the answer is going to be also in the first Mishnah, in the first halacha of this tractate, where it's going to refer to the original peah was given properly at the end of the field. And since that amount discharged the field's peah obligation, it is understandable that any additional stalks designated after should not acquire the status of peah. But in the present case of what we're talking about with Rabbi Yasa, the peah that was set aside originally, although sufficient in the amount, did not discharge the field's peah obligation because it was given improperly, because it was given at the beginning or the middle of the field, but it wasn't given at the end yet. Therefore, it is still permissible, it's still possible to designate additional peah. In other words, let's say you left it on the first day in the middle, and effectively what they're saying is that if you did it where it's 1/60th, and that last stalk would come up to be the last stalk that would make the whole thing 1/60th, and you did that at the end, and that's adding to it so that can be done where it's one way. And if it's not adding up to that last stalk being 1/60th, in other words, if he's just leaving it to be at the end of the field to match the biblical obligation to say at the end of the field, then you can leave it another way in terms of being detached or not detached from the ground. In other words, the the final stalk can be left detached, and the final stalk to be 1/60th, and the one that would be uh, more than 1/60th, but to do the final part at the end uh, would be would still be attached. So so there's a lot going on here. Um, so what about this idea of it being hefker? In other words, what Rabbi Yudah is saying is he's saying that, well, if you didn't do this process at the end, he's effectively saying that you actually just didn't leave Peah. It's hefker. In other words, he's saying that um, you have to go through the status of leaving 1/60th, but that last part, that you didn't trigger the obligation unless you're doing something at the end. And what the Sadeh Yeshua is pointing out is that um, is that doing it at the end um, triggers it, but that if you didn't yet trigger it, that you're still allowed to add to the pay obligation. But once you leave the last stalk and you say, okay, it's at the end and here's the last stalk, now you're done with the pay obligation. So now you can't add to it, because if you start adding to it now, you're taking away something that should actually be subject to tithes. So I'll bet you didn't know there was this much going on with Peah, but there is. And this is really, really important for us even today, because we have to be very sensitive to honest weights and measures. This is something that the Hofetz Chaim always talked about doing things to study honest weights and measures. And this is one way for us to connect to that. And also to be more sensitive to, to the fine points of not doing theft, because the Torah puts Peah next to these laws of honest weights and measures and theft for us to think about it. Because if we're not discharging this obligation of Peah, in effect, you're taking away food from poor people. This is really something that's supposed to go to the poor people, and it really is going to be a form of theft, as we're going to see later. So I encourage everybody to join us tomorrow, where we're going to go over chapter 1, Halacha 4 of Peah, and we're going to get into all sorts of exciting things there. So thank you so much, and we'll see you again tomorrow.